A reading from Exodus. The Lord spoke to Moses, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is this?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer per person, according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. This is the word of the Lord.
It is good to be with you this morning. For the past 3 years, my family and I have been a part of the Wilshire family, literally on the day we moved to Dallas, and in no small measure thanks to the matchmaking skills of Mark Wingfield. Literally on the day we moved to Dallas, before we'd even slept one night, we were welcomed by the Seeker class to a pool party. So we have been experiencing Wilshire hospitality literally from the day that we moved to Dallas. We're very grateful for it, grateful for that subset of the Wilshire community. Though I will point out this week that in our class email that went out, Jill Granberry announced that Allison Cook's husband would be preaching today. Well played, Jill Granberry, well played. And let me admit, thankfully true. So today is Trinity Sunday on the Christian calendar, which is always significant, but I hope that you will forgive me for moving in a slightly different direction this morning. Despite the fact that my family and I have been a part of Wilshire for a few years now, most of you probably don't know me. I actually met a person who's a part of the Wilshire family this morning who introduced herself to me, and she asked what my connection was to Wilshire, and I admitted with some chagrin that I had been here for 3 years. Most Sundays, I am out preaching in other churches. I'm currently the interim pastor at the First Baptist Church of Abilene, Texas, a sister church to Wilshire. But because you don't know me that well, I hope you won't mind if I begin with a bit of a confession this morning. You might think me strange after you hear it and stop listening to the sermon, but I hope you won't. Here it is. I do not like leftovers. My wife, Allison, is a wonderful cook. My kids would tell you that there are even a few things that I can fix that are pretty good, but there is just something about reheating a meal that is distasteful to me, if you will. A meal begins all hot and fresh, but when it goes into the refrigerator to live for a season, let's be honest, it just sucks the life right out of it. The good news is, I have discovered that as someone who does not like leftovers, that I have the Bible on my side. If you were to let your eyes wander into the text this morning, into Exodus 16, you would discover that it's right there in black and white. God bans leftovers. In Exodus 16, we find the Israelites fresh out of their captivity in Egypt. God has been doing what can only be described as incredible things on their behalf. God had sent Moses to confront the Pharaoh. Then God brought a series of disasters to convince the Pharaoh of the need to let the Israelites go. After that, God parted the Red Sea to allow them to pass through while letting it crash down on the Egyptian army after Pharaoh changed his mind and came after them. So now, finally, in our text this morning, they have been released from their bondage. They have been safely delivered by God. And what do the people do in Exodus 16? After all that incredible activity on God's part, they start complaining. If only, they said, we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food that we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. I think if it had been me, if I had done all that stuff for them that God had done, I would have been tempted to let them get a whole lot thinner. That is not what God did. It's probably good that God is in charge, not me. And so God tells Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day, and this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they will bring in. That is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. And do you remember, even without the text that we have read this morning, what the name of that bread from heaven is? That's right, it's called manna, which is one of my favorite biblical words. Manna is our anglicized version of the Hebrew word, which is manhu, which literally means, what the heck is this stuff? For 40 long years, the Israelites would go out each day and gather enough for just a day's worth of food. No more, because the manna wouldn't keep. If the people tried to hoard it, it spoiled overnight. In the morning, it stank. It was filled with bugs and worms. When the noon sun hit it, it melted. So their limit was 2 quarts of manna per day per person. I'm guessing they learned to fix manna in every way that you could possibly conceive. Boiled manna, fried manna, baked manna, manna kebabs. They probably had arguments about whether wet manna or dry rub manna was the best. The only exception was the Sabbath, since God wanted the people to rest on that day. There was no manna to be found. God let them gather twice as much the day before, and it lasted 2 days instead of the normal one, so the people rested on the Sabbath. Then, the next day, they were back at it, living one day at a time, depending upon the providence of God. Have you ever tried to do that? Live one day at a time, depending upon the providence of God, not knowing what tomorrow will bring, simply trusting that whatever it brings will be what a good God has in store for you. It's tough, let's be honest. The Cooks are Oklahoma people. Our family tells stories about my grandfather's generation growing up in the Dust Bowl days of early Oklahoma. My grandfather was one of 9 children, and his father passed away when he was only 12 years old, leaving 9 mouths to feed. And so, in a hard place and a terrible economy, his mother had to work desperately hard to make ends meet. Some nights, he remembers lying awake listening to my great-grandmother's soft cries because there wasn't any food in the house. She didn't know how she was going to feed her family tomorrow. Do you have a story like that in your family background? I bet a lot of us here do. I'm guessing that some of us here this morning probably even lived life like that at some point. And strange as it sounds, I think most of us tend to celebrate those moments. I know my family does. My grandfather's character was stamped by those days, and his values shaped my father's values, who shaped my own. And yet, if we celebrate those moments from our heritage, then why do we often have such a hard time living them out in the present. Let me tell you a story. I was reading an article in Smithsonian Magazine a few months ago about America's first national celebrity. Most of you have probably heard or even seen David Copperfield, the illusionist, on TV, or maybe in Vegas. Maybe you prefer David Blaine. David Blaine is the guy that buried himself alive and then suspended himself over the Thames River in London. Well, before David Blaine or David Copperfield, even before Harry Houdini, there was an entertainer by the name of Charles Blondin. This article in the Smithsonian Magazine talked about all of the various things that he would do to entertain crowds. He did a number of incredible things, but his most famous stunt ever came in 1859 when he walked an 1,100-foot tightrope suspended 160 feet above the waters of Niagara Falls. Now, being at that height is scary enough, but think about the wind and think about the moisture on the wire that you're walking and that you have to walk safely. And so he walked across the wire with a balance pole, and then he threw it off to the side, and the crowd cheered. And then the crowd watched from the American side, their eyes squinting a bit, recognizing that he was coming back toward them. And this time he was pushing a wheelbarrow across the wire. He began to inch closer and closer to the American side, and when he got there, the crowd erupted in cheers at this tremendous feat. He held up his hands for quiet and said, "How many of you think I could do it again?" And they wanted to see him do it again, so as you can imagine, they applauded at the top of the volume. They cheered at the top of their lungs. "How many of you think that I could take the wheelbarrow back across?" And they cheered. And then he asked a really interesting question. "How many of you think I can take somebody in the wheelbarrow?" And who would like to go for a ride? Nobody cheered. Crickets. If I'm honest, I'd tell you that for me, it's a whole lot easier to thank God for yesterday's manna than trust God for tomorrow's daily bread. What about you? One of the things that we love about Wilshire is how amazing the people of this congregation are. There are so many people in this congregation who are intentional and capable and accomplished. Assistant Vice President for Manna Procurement, Director of Manna Research, Chief Bread Officer. Wilshire is that kind of place. And maybe that's why the story in Exodus 16 can speak to us. In verses 17 and 18, we see the Israelites out gathering manna. Some gathered a lot, some gathered a little. But at the end, when they measure it, those who gathered a lot didn't have too much, and those who gathered a little didn't have too little. And then this profound statement, each one gathered as much as was needed. The point is, God worked it out. The people could trust God to meet their needs, which shouldn't have surprised them. God had already been working on their behalf, and they'd seen it in action. God had saved them from the Egyptians. It shouldn't have surprised them that God would save them from hunger as well. But some of them doubted. In verse 20, we get this very funny picture. Moses has told the people not to hold on to yesterday's manna, but some did. I have this picture in my head of these hardworking type A Israelites who wanted to get a jump on tomorrow's meal. So they go to bed with some manna hid away in their tents, only to wake up the next morning with their tent smelling like the inside of a college guy's refrigerator, filled with food that should have been thrown out a year and a half ago. We should be thankful for yesterday's manna, but we shouldn't hold on to it. And that's because God is always in the habit of giving us fresh bread. This is a lesson that American Christians need our Jewish brothers and sisters to remind us of from time to time. That relentless trust for them was a powerful word in the midst of difficult times. The most meaningful stories of the Jewish people keeping Sabbath are the times when they kept it amidst crisis and terror. They kept it under siege. They kept it in famine. They kept it in drought. They kept it in Warsaw's ghettos and Hitler's death camps and Stalin's gulags. They kept it when the world was falling apart. And if you ask the rabbis, they will tell you that our Jewish brothers and sisters didn't so much keep the Sabbath in those moments so much as the Sabbath kept them. That's what relentless trust will do. It reminded them that they were God's and that God would provide. I don't have to tell you that we live in anxious times, and sadly we see what happens when people stop trusting the good God who is creator, redeemer, and sustainer. We don't welcome aliens and strangers, we fear them. We don't turn swords into plowshares, we turn them into AR-15s. Rather than trusting the good God who provides, we clench our fists tight, we hoard our bread rather than sharing it. Is it naive? Or is it just courageous to say that there isn't one problem that we face in this world that couldn't be solved or at least massively improved if we just could learn to trust the God who loves us enough to provide and arrange our lives and the way we treat others around that belief? And if we can discover how that works on such a grand scale, it can certainly work in our lives too, right? What is yesterday's manna for you? The career path that you were on? The way that you thought your marriage would look? The plan that you had in mind for your children? Much of the time, yesterday's manna was something wonderful, a good gift that we give thanks to God for. Sometimes it is more about what we thought has to be true, and so we keep holding on long after the expiration date. But let me remind you that we are here to worship the God who is offering fresh bread. And let me gently encourage you to trust that. Trust God to restore a rocky marriage or heal you if it's already ended. Trust God that your children are going to figure out who they are and whose they are. Fresh bread. And it's probably already occurred to you, but in this season of change at Wilshire, we can trust that God is going to provide, right? We can move forward in a posture of trust. And why? Because we have this amazing history of bread raining down from heaven, right? I don't know what it's going to look like. Not even the search committee knows. But God does. So let's trust it. Finally, in the midst of that silent crowd at Niagara Falls, one person spoke up. "I'll go," she said. And so everyone watched with bated breath as they slowly made their way across. And when they got to the other side, a reporter who was waiting for them asked the woman exactly what you'd expect. "How was it?" She paused for a moment, and then with a big smile on her face, she said, "It was quite a ride." What about you? Who wants to go for a ride?